Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of Director John Fiume and Deputy Director Seema Rao of the Akron Art Museum, along with Dean Mark Mistour and Director Yvonne Bernal of the Kent State College of Architecture and Environmental Design, that I'll refer to as CAED. I'm excited to welcome our in-person and online audiences to the Photographic Architecture Symposium. I'm John Yoder, Associate Professor at Kent State, and this event is actually the fourth in a series of architecture and visual media symposia I've organized over the past 14 years. These events included Televisuality in Syracuse in 2008, Vision and Visuality in Architecture in New York in 2013, Graphic Novels Novel Architecture in Cleveland in 2016, and now Photographic Architecture here in Akron and Kent in 2022. I'll be moderating the events tonight here in the Leonard Auditorium at the Akron Art Museum, which is a wonderful building designed by Coop Himmelblau, I should note, and then also tomorrow in the Scene Lecture Hall at Kent State University, which is in another great building designed by Weissman Frady. Both days will feature an international roster of photographic artists, designers, and scholars for presentations, film screenings, design reviews, book signings, and roundtable discussions. In addition to our guests, Beatriz Colomina, Luisa Lambri, Martino Stierli, and Jesus Vasayo, who are here in person, thankfully. We're also joined by Anastasia Savinova, who will be participating remotely from Sweden. Of course, many people contributed to the production of this program. I won't thank all of them right now, but I want to call attention to the important contributions of Dean Mark Mistour for supporting the symposium through funding, staffing, and many of his own personal efforts. Thanks also to John Fiume and Seema Rao of the Akron Art Museum. Hopefully this is the beginning of a really productive partnership of ongoing programming. Also, architecture librarian Nick Fagan has been really incredible for quickly obtaining books and films throughout the semester. And our teleproductions team here is just really one of the best. My thanks to Shane Roach, Jason Forbes, Mark Warzinski, and Chris Smith for making things as seamless as possible. There are many colleagues in the CAED who helped out with this event, and I especially want to thank Taraneh Meshkani, Steve Rugari, and Greg Stroh from our faculty, as well as business manager Beth Noga, Stephanie Sotomayor, Mariah Taylor, and Deanna Burritt-Peffer from the Dean's Office. Jeffrey Waldman designed the symposium website and postcard, and graduate student Jordan Capus took the photograph here in Akron on which the postcard is based. And along with them, I want to thank all 10 students in my graduate design studio this semester. They've been good partners as a kind of production team over the course of the semester. This event has been 3 years in the making, because it had to be postponed from April 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's been a really difficult 2 years. We've lost friends, family members, and colleagues, and we certainly have ample cause for despair, which has only been intensified by Vladimir Putin's tragic war on Ukraine. But we also have cause for optimism, I would suggest. We've experienced broad cultural movements for social justice and equity, and architectural culture itself finally seems ready for substantive change as groups such as the Architecture Lobby and other unionization efforts emerge as active and thankfully effective agents for change. Architects, students, and faculty are now pushing to transform the long-standing abusive and dysfunctional practices of both the architecture discipline and profession. This symposium is another reason for optimism. We're mostly back together in person again, staging the kind of direct intellectual debate that I've personally missed more than I realized. In the context of the age of Instagram and the rise of image culture, what better time to discuss the constructive and projective relationships between architecture and photography? But what do I mean exactly by photographic architecture? It's not architectural photography, which documents and disseminates images of buildings designed by architects. It's also not photogenic architecture, of which there are innumerable examples, and this building is one for sure. It's not even photographic architecture in terms of buildings that share tendencies and sensibilities with photographic traditions. The hyphen is crucial in photographic architecture because it's intended to suggest that architecture can be designed with, not only documented by, photography. We're familiar with the famous collaborations between architect Richard Neutra and photographer Julia Shulman, for example. Their essays in Cartesian perspective include the Singleton House and Kaufman House, shown here. And of course, we're all familiar with Shulman's iconic photo of Pierre Koenig's case study house number 22, or the Stahl House. These images make the Cartesian conspiracy between house and camera seem natural and inevitable, until that is an already distorted, what I call widescreen architecture, like the work of John Lautner. The Malin House, or Chemisphere, is shown here. This is on the left a celebrity photographer, Douglas Kirkland. He made this image of the Chemisphere with a fisheye lens for a spread in Life magazine in the 1970s. And it's certainly anathema to the one-point perspectives of Shulman and what came to be regarded as a non-distorted mode of image construction. Now, the impossibly wide apertures of Lautner's Sheets-Goldstein house seem also to defy conventional framing and Cartesian perspective. Interestingly, Louisa Lambrey defies the width of Lautner's apertures by focusing on textures, shadows, and other atmospheric effects in unbelievably, to me, someone who's been to the Sheets-Goldstein house 20 or 30 times, it's unbelievably the same house. She's just as responsible for creating ambient effects as the architects whose buildings she photographs. Also, Anastasia Savanova's work is an important example of photographic architecture. Her photo montages combine textures and forms from different vernacular buildings into an architecture of image. And these are just a few of the examples that I hope Anastasia will show in her presentation tomorrow. As Jesus Vasallo argues, there's certainly something synchronized between everyday industrial environments and the kind of deadpan reportage made famous by the likes of Bernd and Hilla Becker. If we can get there we go. Also, Hiroshi Sugimoto, in his well-known long exposure shots that literally highlight the textures of decaying ornament of once grand theaters. So the technique here, so everyone understands, he leaves the shutter on the camera open and essentially etches this bright white screen in the center, and then also etches the kind of textures through the bouncing of light from the screen onto the walls and ceilings of the adjacent surfaces. There's also something about the ruin porn tours of Detroit, and here I would add Cleveland and Akron to the list of cities where photographic forensics, it provides a kind of probing of possibilities, which are picked up by the photogrammetry and texture mapping of post-digital firms such as Team in their Ghost Box project, and also in the Detroit Reassembly Plant. Ghost Box, and then the Detroit Reassembly Plant next. So the roster of photographic architects and artists could go on, and I look forward to discussing many of them over the course of this two-day event. We'll have plenty of chances for discussion and questions from the audience, but first let's get things started with two iconic short films. The first film is by Chris Marker, who was a French New Wave filmmaker and multimedia artist who made his first short film, La Jetée, in 1962. This film won the award for Best First Work at the Venice Film Festival and Golden Dove Award at the Leipzig DOK Festival in 1963. La Jetée is a time travel film set in a post-apocalyptic future. Its subject matter and techniques are particularly relevant at a time in which post-human projects are offering arguments about the Anthropocene, and neo-primitivist practices are fabricating rocks and claiming to uncover non-human archaeology, as well as machine learning and artificial intelligence, which are calling into question all kinds of long-standing anthropocentric assumptions. The narrative of La Jetée unfolds through a series of filmed black and white photographs with voiceover narration. It's the film that many filmmakers and even architects wish they had made. For those of you here in person tonight, we'll now screen this landmark 28-minute film. For our online audience, the film is available for streaming on the Criterion channel. Please rejoin our live stream again in half an hour after this special screening of Chris Marker's La Jetée. I give you La Jetée. Thank you. Welcome back. Some indelible images there for sure. I hope our online audience was able to view La Jetée the way we were. Our next film is made by Catherine Opie, who is a world-renowned fine art photographer who lives and works in Los Angeles, where she was recently appointed chair of the art department at UCLA. Her photographic work often creatively merges deadpan reportage with identity politics in the construction of provocative portraits and landscapes. Her work is part of the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art and the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, and she has had numerous solo shows worldwide. She's also a native of Sandusky, Ohio, only 1 hour away from here, so some of you surely experienced her extraordinary large-scale photographic installation titled The Outside Inside at MoCA Cleveland in 2019. I invited Catherine to join us live tonight, but today is her birthday, and she's spending it in the mountains with her family. So instead, she generously recorded a short introduction to her 2017 film, The Modernist, which, as she notes, is an homage to La Jetée that was photographed on location at iconic modern houses in Los Angeles. If you're watching, Kathy, happy birthday, and thanks for making your film available for our screening here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Catherine Opie.
I'm Catherine Opie. I'm here in my studio in Los Angeles, wishing that I was actually there with all of you. I know you're about ready to see a screening of The Modernist, and I thought I would go over a little bit in terms of what that film means and why I made it for you. So in 2016, I started making The Modernist, completing it in 2017. And it was always in relationship to having a conversation with a film that was made in 1962, the year that after I was born, which is Chris Marker's La Jetée. La Jetée deals with the future and the fear of nuclear war. And The Modernist focuses on one character by the name of Pigpen, who's a friend that I have photographed many times within the work. And you'll notice throughout this film that Pigpen begins to basically create a collage of modernist houses that they have started to burn down. And so it's all in black and white stills, same amount of time as La Jetée, which is 28 minutes. And you'll see this character going through numerous cycles of whether or not you know it's a dream state or not a dream state. The notion of reflection is incredibly important. Michael Maltzan, the architect here in Los Angeles, designed the theater in which was placed in the middle of the gallery, and then around it were actually vertical photographs, more in the style of portraiture that I made while making the film. So sit back, enjoy. I know you will probably have a lot of questions in the audience for it, and I wish I was there to answer them. But just realize that it's really kind of my question of the failure of the utopic vision and grappling with the relationship of also the future that has changed quite drastically since case study and modernist houses were built here in Los Angeles. And then the other aspect of it also is something that we live with in California all the time, which is fire. And so thank you very much for coming to this screening, and I hope you enjoy it. Have a nice night.
Thank you again, Catherine Opie, for allowing us to screen your film, The Modernist. I'm excited to introduce our speaker for tonight. Please save your questions regarding both films, as well as the forthcoming presentation for our roundtable discussion. Martino Stierle is the Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where he oversees the special exhibitions, installations, and acquisitions of the Department of Architecture and Design. Before joining MoMA, he was the Swiss National Science Foundation professor at the University of Zurich's Institute of Art History. He has taught at Columbia and Princeton universities, the universities of Zurich and Basel, and the ETH Zurich, where he earned his PhD. His widely published research on architecture and media has focused on the work of practices including Venturi Scott Brown, Herzog and de Meuron, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, Rem Koolhaas, Johnston Mark Lee, and Ed Ruscha. Martino has also co-curated landmark exhibitions including Toward a Concrete Utopia, Architecture in Yugoslavia, 1948 to 1980. That was in 2018. And by the way, I think it might be the best show I've personally seen at MoMA, so congratulations on that show. He also curated The Architecture of Hedonism, 3 villas in the island of Capri for the Venice Architecture Biennale of 2014, and the International Traveling Exhibition Las Vegas Studio, Images from the Archives of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown from 2008 to 2014. His books include Las Vegas in the Rearview Mirror, The City in Theory, Photography, and Film from 2010, and Montage and the Metropolis, Architecture, Modernity, and the Representation of Space from 2018. In fact, this book, titled Montage and the Metropolis, is the title of Martino's talk tonight, which will help set the stage for the rest of this 2-day symposium. The book will be available for signing tomorrow in the Kent State CAED, but tonight we're extremely excited to welcome him to Northeast Ohio and the Akron Art Museum. Please join me in welcoming Martino Stierle.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for the more than generous introduction, John, and the invitation to speak here tonight. And also thank you so much to the Akron Art Museum for so generously hosting us. That said, John, I have to say you really put me in a difficult spot here. Having to speak after Chris Marquer and Kathy Opie is not going to be an easy task. So I'll do my best to tell you very briefly some of the ideas that underlie my book, Montage and the Metropolis, that will hopefully be helpful for our conversation later. Let me start with a couple of images to just illustrate to you what triggered my interest in thinking about montage. It's an image like this that you're all very familiar with. Images in architectural culture from the 20th century that project a bold vision of what a world yet to come might look like in juxtaposition with an existing urban fabric. Another example would be this one here. By L. Lisitsky. My book centers around 3 key terms: modernity as a historical and economic condition we all live in, the metropolis as one of the key cultural instantiations of that condition, and montage as perhaps what I try to show in my book as the symbolic form that underlies modernity at large and that is intrinsically connected to the metropolis, the phenomenon of the metropolis as a cultural, economic, political, visual, and aesthetic phenomenon. My book is interdisciplinary in character, and so one of the key reference points for me is the Berlin Dada moment immediately following World War I. I'm showing here a seminal piece by Hannah Höch with the programmatic title "Cut with the Kitchen Knife Through the Last Weimar Beer Belly Cultural Epoch in Germany," which I think is a beautiful sort of representation of what was at stake in the Dadaist reimagination of visual culture of the 20th century by breaking it down into fragments and reassembling it and creating meaning through juxtaposition of mass prefabricated visual imagery. And of course then the adaptation of techniques such as that into architecture culture, here with a page from Space, Time and Architecture by Siegfried Gideon. My first chapter is really a theoretical introduction into montage thinking and trying to define the chapter in 5 takes. The first one being that montage is predicated by a plurality of the image. I'm trying to show that here with a very famous photograph showing the French politician and art historian André Malraux working on his Museum Without Walls, which was one of the first attempts of writing a global art history with its own problems. That being said, one of the most striking images, I think, that also represents the ready availability of imagery from all over the world that is made possible by the ability to reproduce images in large quantities. The second point I'm trying to make is that montage relies on adjacency and juxtaposition of individual images, and that meaning is produced by their juxtaposition and combination into new plural images. I'm showing you here one of the atlases of the Mnemosyne Atlas by the German art historian Abi Warburg to illustrate this point. The third point, directly related, montage relies on polyfocality. It is different from the perspectual, the scopic regime of perspectivalism, which was the dominant scheme in Western visual culture from the Renaissance. Montage breaks that up and produces an image that is based on a plurality of viewpoints brought together in one single image. My fourth point is that montage relies on technological reproducibility and, of course, industrial production that underlies technological reproducibility. I think this idea of montage or assemblage of prefabricated industrially produced parts is very beautifully illustrated here in this sequence of images of the construction of the Eiffel Tower. And of course, all of these elements are technologically reproduced, which is sort of a theme that is also true for montage as a visual phenomenon. And then the last and final point, talking about visual culture, montage is the outcome of a perceptual revolution brought about by the mechanized modern metropolis, and by the extension of the human body with new technological apparatuses such as the movie camera or also the photographic camera. And now, continuing in this sort of introductory theoretical overview, I'm comparing montage with a few related terms, assemblage, which is a key term introduced in Manfredo Tafuri's book Architecture and Utopia, which again clearly references the technological apparatus of industrialization. Collage, of course. What is the difference between montage and collage, given in particular that the term collage has a very sort of famous career, particularly in postmodern architectural thinking, of course, through the book Collage City by Colin Rowe and Fred Koetter, but also by many other publications. Bricolage, which is also a concept introduced in Collage City, but taken from Claude Lévi-Strauss's La Pensée Sauvage, where he makes a difference between sort of the pre-modern bricoleur and the modern scientist, which is something that is then taken up again in the postmodern period in this book by Joss Jenks and Nathan Silver, Adjacency, where they advocate for an architecture that is fully based on prefabricated materials, where the architect really becomes a shopper and a combiner as opposed to a designer. And then finally, the capriccio, a more art historical term, which again has a career in postmodern architectural thought. It plays a key role in Aldo Rossi's The Architecture of the City. The next two chapters in my book, the book is 6 chapters, are an attempt of reconstructing the history of montage, and in particular photomontage, with regard to the representation of architecture and space and the modern metropolis. I've already invoked the Dadaist moment. I'm showing you here again Hannah Höch with Raoul Hausmann at the first International Dada Fair, which was one of the first times that the Dadaists presented their work in public. I also am making a point of going back to vernacular image culture from the late 19th century. This is a Prussian military souvenir that consisted in a mass-reproduced sort of landscape with these bodies of soldiers, and then individually soldiers could glue in their images into that, and these things would be sent around back home to the families at home. And this is actually from the collection of Hannah Höch, and she signs it, makes it a work of Dadaist art, and says this is the beginning of photomontage. Then, of course, also very early, the introduction of architectural drawings in photographs as a predecessor of what I then define as photomontage. Later in the 20th century, here an example by Friedrich von Thiersch from 1902. Or then later on, again, more this question or point of the juxtaposition, here a photomontage from referencing my hometown Zurich, Karl Moser, the first president of SIAM, where he clearly references Le Corbusier's Plan Voisin and juxtaposes his very utopian modernist scheme that was to replace the old town of Zurich against the backdrop of the 19th century city on the hill with Stemper's ETH main building and the university headquarters by Karl Moser himself. And then the next 3 chapters are then looking at key figures of montage thinking in the 20th century. I'm starting with Mies van der Rohe. I was very taken by this image showing Mies at the first International Dada Fair. We again have Hannah Höch on the very left, among many other Dada artists of the Berlin Dada Circle, and Mies here standing in the back. And I'm trying to then make an argument that this was a key moment for how Mies started to think about his own architectural production and the representation of his architectural production. Let's not forget that Mies was, of course, a very prolific architect builder, but he was also an editor and an image producer, as seen here in his editorial role as of the avant-garde art magazine G that he co-founded. And 2 cover images representing actually works by Mies van der Rohe here. And now I'm trying to get to my next image. So Mies again starts out very early with using photomontage by gluing photographs of models of projects into existing landscapes, here in a project from 1910. But then what happens after the encounter with the Dadaists, my argument is that something completely different happens. Here we have now sort of a very active juxtaposition of a project yet to come as against the existing city, sort of defining architecture as the complete other to a pre-existing reality, which was not the case before. Of course, this goes on in his post-war work. I'm showing you here the IIT campus project with a photomontage representing, again, this idea of superimposing a completely different vision of a city into the pre-existing urban landscape. The Chicago Convention Hall that references political imagery here, the convention of the Republican Party. That photograph is appropriated by Mies and brought into this convention, and then I developed then a conversation about the political stance of Mies by comparing it with another famous photo montage from the 1930s, this time a fascist example, Giuseppe Terrani's Casa del Fascio. The images are strikingly similar in their juxtaposition of a highly technologized vision of architecture and mass culture as the two prime sort of references of 20th century architecture culture, and in particular the post-war moment of the military-industrial complex in the United States. I have then another take on on the meaning of windows in architecture, in Mies's architectural representation, in his photo montages, the outlook window of the Resor House project as a aestheticization of the outside world, which I'm putting into relationship with another aestheticization of the outside world in the Great Hall of Hitler's Berghof retreat above Berchtesgaden. The second of my three monographic chapters is dealing with the Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein, who was one of the key theorists of cinematic montage. He was also trained as an architect and a civic engineer, and he would repeatedly return to architecture. And he was also close friends with Le Corbusier. Here, an image in their film for the first encounter in 1928, together with their joint collaborator, Andrei Burov. And what I'm particularly interested in this chapter is an analysis of Eisenstein's posthumously published essay, Montage and Architecture, where he makes where he presents the argument that the ancient Greek polis, the Acropolis in particular, was a predecessor of cinematic montage. And of course, he is referencing here a piece of French architectural theory from the late 19th century, Auguste Choisy's Histoire de l'Architecture, where he introduces the idea that that the Greek polis was actually not axially organized, but was based on a spectator moving through space. And this idea of moving through space, of embodied spectatorship, is what leads then to Eisenstein's cinematic montage. And of course, we should also point out that the exact same imagery and the exact same source is used by Le Corbusier in his manifesto from 1922 toward an architecture, and that would lead to his notion of the promenade architecturale, the architectural promenade, which again is, of course, a cinematic understanding of the exploration of space. Eisenstein also devised a film script that was never realized, The Glass House, which is his take on transparency in architecture. It was inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's St. Mark's in the Bowery Towers project, also unexecuted. And we can see this notion of transparency in many instances in Eisenstein's cinematic production, with his interest in the superimposition of images on top of each other, which of course make us think of Eugène Atget and also surrealist experiments with this kind of superimposition of images on top of each other. And I'm actually was very inspired also by the show that's currently on view here in the museum that deals with such mirroring effects in 20th century and 21st century visual culture. And of course, I also want to bring this into conversation with this very famous double-page spread again from Siegfried Gideon's Time, Space and Architecture, where he is introducing the concept of montage as the base for what he calls a new space conception. And then finally, to wrap things things up. My sixth and last chapter deals with Delirious New York by Rem Koolhaas. Here, the title page of the original edition from 1978, and I put it into a conversation with Walter Benjamin's unfinished Arcades project from the late 20s and from the late 1920s and 1930s that he worked on incessantly for the last 12 years before his death. And like Delirious New York, I'm showing you here a double-page spread where we have sort of the replacement of a traditional narrative history, urban history, by sort of very brief takes, programmatic takes that are montaged together. So the idea of literary montage here that underlies Koolhaas's thinking, which is also evident in his second manifesto, SML XL, here with this encyclopedia, as it were, of terms relating to architecture. Then, of course, the city itself as a montage, underlying an orthogonal Cartesian grid, but then with a juxtaposition of wildly disparaging individual ideas of what architecture should be. Here, the city of the captive globe, that I'm putting into a relationship with Emilio Ambas's installation for the New Domestic Landscape, the seminal New Domestic Landscape exhibition in MoMA, at MoMA from 1972, 50 years ago, which is also very much predicated on this very same idea of the juxtaposition of disparaging elements in a Cartesian grid. In fact, Ambas wrote about Manhattan as the capital of the 20th century, which seems to be a direct predecessor of Rem Koolhaas's idea of New York, the capital of the 20th century, and of course a sequel to Walter Benjamin's understanding of Paris as the capital of the 19th century in his Arcades project. Of course, OMA and Koolhaas would use photomontage repeatedly also for the visualization of some of their most seminal works, here Exodus or The Voluntary Prisoners, which were inspired themselves by other photomontages. So I'm also, sort of trying to establish a history of visualizations speaking to each other in a discourse of images among themselves. And then finally, I was also struck by Koolhaas and Madelon Friesendorp's collection of postcards referencing New York. And here one of the suitcases in which they kept their postcards, and these postcards became inspirations for Delirious New York in the sense that they were seen by Koolhaas and Friesendorp as representations of the architectural unconscious of the anonymous culture of early 20th century New York, whose history had to be written retroactively in the manifesto that will become Delirious New York. And of course, I also want to reference here Alvin Boyarski's Chicago a la carte, which is a very similar attempt of writing the history of Chicago based on postcards. And just to conclude, this, of course, also has a larger history in 20th century visual culture. Paul Éluard, a surrealist poet, French poet, here with a page spread from Les Plus Belles Cartes Postales from 1933, knowing that the surrealists were all very much interested in postcards as repositories of the unconscious of modernity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Martino, for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to welcome our symposium participants to the stage now for a roundtable discussion and then some audience questions. So please join us on stage. Wow. What a lovely presentation and two wonderful film screenings. It's a delight to have everyone here tonight in person and Anastasia Savinova joining us on screen. Hi, Anastasia. Can you hear us?
Hello, yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Great. Yes, we can see you. Thanks for joining remotely. So we'll have a number of questions from the audience, I'm sure, but just to get things rolling, Martino, in your talk, you present Montage very much as a kind of speculative envisioning of modernity's power and the kind of assertion of that power through Mies and other artists. And it seems strikingly synchronized to me with the vision of Catherine Opie, who is also seeing the kind of assertion of power as something that could be then operated on or undermined through a kind of photomontaging technique. Is that something that you would agree with or run with a bit?
Interestingly, I had a sort of similar thought. Can you hear me? Oh, I can take it out. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I had a similar thought when I was watching Kathy Opie's film, which I, by the way, didn't know. So I'm very glad I was able to see that. And indeed, I guess, my book, my investigation really deals sort of with the 20th century utopias. Of course, also with a somewhat dystopian final chapter on delirious New York. And then Kathy Opie, of course, deconstructs these utopias and shows how they've, slowly come to an end. And of course, it's very interesting to note that the representation of the modernist, who is at the same time the arsonist of modernity's work, is actually an impromptu collage, or you could even call it a montage on the back wall, and it's constantly sort of written over and amended. So in an interesting way, we have almost a reversal of, I think, what my book is trying to do, sort of showing that visualization images have the power to produce a new built reality in a future yet to come, whereas the modernist seems to suggest that the power of modernity is used up and it can only continue living in a after the fact reduction into a two-dimensional montage hung on the wall.
I think it points to an interesting and potentially important distinction between some of the case study houses that the character Pigpen was seeking to burn or destroy as emblems of a kind of modern power, let's say. A distinction between the case study houses and the projects of John Lautner, which are kind of on the big screen and seen as images of the assertion of power. I remember talking with Ken Adam, who was the production designer for the James Bond film series and also the production designer for Dr. Strangelove. And he said he remembers Stanley Kubrick telling him that the triangle is the strongest shape. And he wanted the shape of the war room in Dr. Strangelove to reflect that, to be a kind of emblem of ostensibly masculine power. And so the John Lautner residences are on screen, and it's Silvertop, the Sheets Goldstein House, the Chemisphere. These are the ones that Pigpen is visiting in person. And the only other one they visit in person is the Stahl House, case study house number 22. But the case study houses appear throughout the film in the form of books and printed pages, which was arguably the kind of ideal format for the publication of those projects, which are frankly less impressive as demonstrations of power than the John Lautner projects when visited in person. So this distinction, I think, could be important. The printed page and the form of the book, even the book, the Case Study House program book, is massive. And it takes over the table when they're looking through the book, whereas the Lautner projects are somehow concrete and strong and assertive in a very different way that maybe is more in keeping with the large screen or of cinema. Does that strike any?
I don't know. I mean, it was very interesting to see this film, but it's also heartbreaking. I mean, particularly for those of us that love these houses, like, what? What's he doing, right? But it's super interesting what you are saying, because of course the origin of these houses is a magazine. The Case Study Houses originated with Arts and Architecture magazine, so they were commissioned by an editor for publication. So it is not a house that is built and then it gets published because it's nice and whatever. It's the other way around. The editor commissions a house with the condition, she chooses the Case Study House, the condition that the architect finds a real client. And it's a fantastic thing because it's set up completely in the sense that the houses are exhibitions from the beginning, right? The owner had to agree and sign that they will let people pass through the house, and hundreds of thousands of people pass through these houses, sit in their furniture, use their whatever, before they were able to enter their own house. And I suppose they got a lot out of it, not only publicity but you have to think about that. This is a reversal entirely of what we have been understanding as the relationship between architecture, modern architecture, and photography, right? So it is before, it's anticipated already, before even the construction. The images of the project are in the magazine, then the construction, the documentation of the construction, then thousands of people passing through your own house before it. So it exists in the media before it's even built. And what you're saying about the monumentality of the Case Study House book is also very much a point in case, because in fact it was published in this little kind of magazine, Arts and Architecture, which is now hard to find and so on. And they have been monumentalized in this big book, but it's not that at the time. And the houses themselves are also not supposed to be what they are now, these kind of icons of, I don't know, power too, because in recent years they have been bought by people with a lot of money, when in fact they were addressing the middle class, let's say the professional middle class coming back from the war, and as Sentenza say, being used because of the war. And the war is, of course, here in the images of the ruins. I mean, we cannot separate all these images of modernity from the war. They are the consequence of the involvement of America in World War II. Not only were many of these architects deployed in the war, but the ones that were at home, they were working for the military program, including the IMSS, etc. And a lot of these new materials and techniques were the result of the involvement in the war effort. But more interestingly, Sentenza, in the first editorial of these houses, says that men returning from the war had become used to the machine and will no longer want to live in houses with pitched roofs and picket fences and all of that, but they want a house that is, as modern as the machinery of war they had become. So they are totally entangled with war. So it is a very different world that we are living now, in which these houses have become like super expensive. This was not the case just a few years ago. I mean, I remember that. When a modernist house was worth much less than a conventional house. For example, at Princeton, believe it or not, there is one of the Breuer houses, the house that was in the courtyard of the museum. One of the models, right? Because MoMA will distribute the plans and you could build it. So several copies of this butterfly house are in different suburbs of New York. Well, it was for sale. And at a time in which, let's say, in Princeton, you couldn't find anything at all for less than $500,000. We're talking about the 90s, right? I mean, this house was like 100,000. So a PhD student bought it, right? So it was so cheap that it was cheaper for a PhD student to buy this house, and somehow he was an architect, he's an architect, and somehow, and now this has enormous value, and it was the world of Hollywood and celebrities and so that they started to recover this image. And I don't know exactly what is the story with this film, really, but I feel, I don't know whether you felt that, because he's living in a modernist apartment. The man is comfortable with modernism. So why is he, I was kept thinking to myself, why is he setting fire to these houses when he actually loves modern architecture and design? He's surrounded by modern architecture and design himself, right? And I felt like maybe what he was destroying is this reality that these modern houses have become. That at a time in which nobody can even afford to live properly in LA or in many other parts of the country, and that these houses that were a dream for an affordable modern houses have been completely co-opted. I mean, he set fire to them. I don't know. I'm not sure if this is.
Yeah, I mean, another title for the symposium could be the agency of representation, the agency of photographic representation, and the power of representation to undermine, to destroy, to empower, and so on and so forth. So I'm interested in the Lautner projects in particular, not only because I've been doing a long project on Lautner, but also because in films, Lautner houses are often depicted as the kind of playboy pad, the lair of the villain that's always a male villain, that there's something about the male voyeur that these houses, which are scopically extravagant, meaning that they construe these extensive swaths of vision for their occupants. And I think that's something that both Pigpen in this film and in Catherine Opie's film, and also Louisa in your work, in your very focused kind of attention to details and the photography of small, seemingly more intimate imagery in the same houses, that it just seems unfathomable to someone who's interested in the breadth of the view constructed by those houses, that you would audaciously focus so narrowly and intimately on their details. Is that, on your part, also an attempt to undermine a kind of modernist power or a kind of patriarchal power, or something that is at all construed as a gendered model of vision?
A little bit. I really appreciated seeing Kathy Opie's work on this particular occasion. I think that artists have something really quite unusual and special to offer. And I really appreciate when they feel so free to relate to such pieces of history or architecture. So I don't necessarily act in such dramatic ways or exhibit such dramatic gestures. But I also feel as free to play with history and to open up these houses through my photographs and maybe show parts of them which are not necessarily so obvious or visible, or in this case, spectacular. And so just by showing a different kind of experience, I think there might be some value there, or it is somehow worthwhile doing. And of course, it also happens that all of these major and relevant and amazing pieces of architecture were also made by men. So when someone like me somehow happens to find herself in these kind of places, somehow a whole a whole set of events can also happen and take place. And I think there's also something to say about that. So I don't set houses on fire at all, but I maybe just experience that in my own way, and sort of deconstruct definitely a part of these places and then reconstruct them in my own image, maybe, which definitely takes into consideration everything about the architecture. So I don't at all ignore where I am, yet I kind of add a layer to it, and possibly, hopefully, a layer that can be shared in a more sort of private way, or more, in my case, I think it has to do with the experience of architecture in a more psychological or emotional way, rather than a descriptive one. But still, I think there's also a space for that within these very spaces, which are so iconic and irreplaceable. So I think it's just a different point of view, really. Yeah.
Well, they're beautiful photographs. We look forward to seeing more of them tomorrow in the symposium at Kent State. I'm wondering, the agency of Montage. Anastasia, you've produced some incredible montages, and Jesus, you've written about the kind of power of photomontage. Is there more to say on the kind of power or agency of photomontage as it relates to a certain kind of cultural transformation that we seem, hopefully, to be undergoing at the moment?
Can you elaborate a little bit on that last part of the question?
Yeah, so this notion that we could somehow undermine the patriarchy or the long-standing kind of power structure in architecture through representation, in this case through photomontage or the construction of models and collage and so forth for the purpose of burning it down, I think is a really compelling notion of how to kind of reconfigure the role of representation, which is often understood as a kind of speculative, yes, but assertion of a very particular artist's or creator's vision on the world. It's a very different kind of use of representation that might be more synchronized with contemporary phenomena that have to do with overturning the power structure. And, I mean, in the writing that you've done on photomontage, much of it has to do with a certain kind of subtle, almost not discernible continuity between the real and the artificial. And so I'm wondering, maybe on the one hand, the power of montage, let's say, to transform architectural culture today, and then on the other hand, the importance of subtlety in that transformation. I think that's how I would reframe it.
Yeah, I think that subtlety, I think, is very, very important indeed. And I think maybe that's what differentiates, if we're going to talk about representation as critique or its sort of power to transform, I think, for instance, in the case of Luisa's work, I think it's easier to understand how the subversion is being produced through a much more subtle process by which we get to understand what the emotional relationship is between the artist and the work of architecture, and how this sort of lived experience allows us to then somehow see it with different eyes, right? And so it seems like that's a very it seems like that's a very soft spoken but powerful way to insinuate a transformation of the way that we should be reading and producing architecture, versus perhaps in the film by Opie. I agree with Beatriz that there's something that doesn't quite where the causality is not so clear, right? There's something where it's much harder to understand what is the motivation, or what is the other than the very clear and explicit act of burning things, right? And I think it seems on the one hand you could say that it's too much in your face, right? It's like modern architecture equals capitalism equals patriarchy, and therefore the identity politics is going to come and burn it down. And I think it's a little bit sad, because not only were not these things meant to be, oppressive symbols of power, is that they were never even in the mainstream, like you were suggesting. They were always sort of in the fringes and suggestive of different ways of life that were not normative to begin with, right? So, but I mean, that would be perhaps like a criticism of the Opie film. Another way to talk about it would be perhaps, or the way I was reading it was more that fire has to do with the notion of danger and fear, and how it's somehow very very much in tune with our current moment in time, and how the level of uncertainty in our lives has increased so wildly in the last decade, right? And especially in LA, I think that's exemplified by fire, right, which threatens the very existence of the city. So I think in my mind, it's not so much the artist attacking the architecture, but using architecture as some sort of symbol of stability, and fire as this sort of impending. How do we learn to live with that risk and the fascination of that risk and that destruction, which is the arsonist, perhaps? But maybe I would like to get back to Martino's talk, and also based on Beatrice's comments about the direction of influence, right? So in case of the case study houses, where it's publications influencing or producing even architecture. And I think Martino's book is really, really fascinating in the way that it traces how, first defines a general idea of the term montage with these five concepts, and then traces how montage in graphic media, and then in cinematic media, and then in textual media, encounters the resistance of the specificity of each of these media. Sorry that I repeat myself. And then how then that creates that produces a transformation, or which in turn, each time that this operation happens, or the way I read the book at least, that has a very specific vector of influence on architecture, right? So the Dadaist graphic montage has a very specific influence on the architecture of peace, and so forth, right? And that's, I'm reading, maybe oversimplifying the vector of influence in the book, but I wanted to ask you if in your mind, given that architecture is a discipline that is basically inevitably based on the assembly of heterogeneous components, right? If there would be approaches to montage that are, specific to the medium of architecture, that may have been, on the other hand, exported or had influence on other disciplines.
Well, that's a very good question. I would probably give you the standard answer to that, which is, 19th century engineering, right? Sort of the idea of the pre-assembled building, which is an engineering thing, not an architecture thing in the 19th century, but still it produces a built world as a, as a direct inspiration also for Dadaist artists to come to terms what it means to be living in the modern metropolis, and the totally new visual scopic regime of modernity that these structures, enable and empower. I'm thinking of, Molinage's film of the Pont Transporteur in the port of Marseille, which, he takes as a, it's an engineering structure that creates an entire new, vision of the world around us that is, has, with looking down and up and simultaneously around us. So yes, I think it's a cross, fertilization in both directions. I'm really, this fire thing is really quite fascinating. I mean, there's, I think, a lot to be said also in terms of specific Los Angeles culture of fire. I mean, there's Ed Ruscha's book, Various Small Fires, and there's his famous painting of the art museum on fire, the quintessential modernist representation of power building in in Los Angeles, and that was, of course, a direct reference to the riots in the late 1960s. So that, I think, brings also then into the conversation, sort of the racial undertones of all of that, and I fully agree with what you say, Beatrice, that I think Opie's point here is not that she's critical of modernism to core, as what you were saying, as a representation of power. It's actually the misappropriation of modernist architecture through, we saw, Gagosian. Clearly she's speaking to the aestheticization of the political project, the radical political project of modernist architecture through the forces of capitalism. I think that is what this film is really about. And I think this, projection of a spatial reality, which was embodying a radical political idea as an aestheticization on the wall, its reduction into an image on the wall, I think is the symbolic representation of that for me.
Anastasia, back to the subtlety or the importance of subtlety in photo montage. Your work, absolutely incredible work, and the kind of subtle stitching together of different textures and forms in the creation of these new kind of architectures. What is the importance or power of subtlety, specifically when we're talking about the technique of photo montage for you?
Well, I think in my case, subtlety would mean creation of a world that is almost believable. So I put the images in a subtle way, so I look for the connections between them so they don't clash but more speak with each other. And also reflecting on your question of creation of architecture with help of montage. I'm thinking that it can, in fact, oppose this patriarchy because it presents plural views and like plural voices, right? So montage is not something created by a single creator, which I think is somehow, I may be a little bit messy in how I put it, but I think it has to do with the film also and with this image of a person who wants to have this power of destruction, but it also makes me think of a power of creation, which is a power of the architect, of this very strong architect creating iconic buildings. And montage can be something else, I think. And returning to the film, I'm also thinking about this image of the fire as something that can be coming from nature and also coming from a man in this case. And also she is raising questions of climate change, which is also caused by man. And here it's this intertwining of this power of nature, power of a man, which becomes a destructive power. And somehow it made me think about this image of a strong architect for some reason, and him opposing this image. As he probably wanted to be this strong architect himself. I don't know.
It strikes me that maybe there's something important in terms of your process. We're very interested in your process, and when you've done presentations for my studios in the past, everyone wants to know what the kind of machine or the apparatus of production is. And so when Martino is describing the kind of modernist machine or the modernist apparatus that is somehow technologically reconfiguring what possibilities are, Your process seems to be very intuitive. It's highly personal and gradual and subtle, and it seems to me that it's an explicit alternative to the notion of the modernist machine, that you are neither the kind of sole creative genius in charge of the production of these images, nor is there a kind of technical process of production that takes over in a kind of modernist sense for their pure or transparent production as the result of a streamlined machinic process. Maybe there's something about your process, because we tend to fixate on your images because they're so powerful and subtle at the same time. Maybe there's something more about your process that might have to do with the kind of modernist machinery we're talking about.
Yes, I agree that my process is very intuitive and I'm listening to the space. So it's very important to be in the space and spend time in the city. I think the work also has this agency. It happens gradually on my computer when I work with my photographs. So it evolves in response to each image that I place there, and also those memories of the place, memories of the experiences that I had in the place. And also the diverse images that place has to offer. So it's kind of all sorts of architecture that the place has. So it's not only particular sorts of buildings. So I'm interested in everything that exists. I cannot be this creator who just, in this process, who just thinks of an image, of a perfect image, and then creates it, because I have to start from what exists. So that's probably what makes it really subtle. So it's a reflection on the place, it's a memory of the place, it's an experience of the place, in opposition to a creation of a totally new, clean, modern image or building.
I wonder if we might touch briefly on the difference between La Jetée and the modernist. First, maybe in terms of technique. So there's something about when Chris Marker is literally filming his photographs that gives the image on screen a kind of unstable, almost liquid presence in the space, whereas with Catherine Opie's still images that appear so cleanly and crisply, one after the other, without the kind of cross-dissolve and fade and zoom and pan and some of the other more kind of, by now, traditionally filmic techniques that Marker was using, there seems to be a very different atmosphere that's created, and possibly a different kind of agency in the represented by the different techniques of those two films. Does that light any fires, so to speak?
Well, I think for once the lack of a soundtrack is meant to make you feel unease, right? I think there are moments in La Jetée where it almost feels like a nouvelle vague film, right? There are all these things to soften the blow. No? I think at that point in time, I think he felt it was aggressive enough to do that type of film would be aggressive enough to experience, right? Versus now, I think for Opie, like no soundtrack, like no transition between images are ways to keep you on your toes, perhaps.
Would it be fair to call the singular moments in each film a kind of image of desire in each case, where the sleeping woman opens her eyes and smiles on the one hand in La Jetée, and then when we hear the match strike in the modernist, might they be kind of poignant images of desire in each case?
I think so.
Let's see. Maybe, are there other thoughts before we open it up to the audience?
About something which I didn't think before, but it's also the case that that generation of the modernist architects of the 50s, like the Eames, experimented with this idea of the film based on still images. So the Eames collected a huge amount of slides, not only from them, but also from kids, from their employees. They will give Instamatic cameras to their employees and to the kids of their employees to see what happens, right? And by the way, hundreds of thousands of these slides ended up in the Library of Congress when the archives of the Eames went to the Library of Congress. And I happened to be there with a fellowship at CASBA. And they have no idea. I don't know whether they managed to do anything with it. They knew exactly what to do with the papers, right? The documents, and they go to the Library of Congress, the section of documents and the drawings, and so they go to the architectural archives. But with these hundreds and of thousands of slides, they have no idea what to do. But the point here is that they also did films such as House After 5 Years of Living, precisely a film based on their the construction and the living in this house, precisely is the spirit, which remind very much about what you were talking about your photographies, because in these still images that make the film, there is also a lot about the texture and much less the idea that we have of this modernist photography that we were talking about before, right? I mean, there's a lot of leaves moving, textures of patterns, and also there are always fragments, right? Rather than very rarely in the whole film of House After 5 Years of Living. I think there's one moment that you have kind of a view to the sea, etc. It's never the typical.
Yes. There's a profound difference between the two works, and the reaction is also incredibly different. As dramatic and tragic is the first work, there's also an incredible soothing element to it. So because of the pace, the texture, the grain, the music, it's also incredibly calming and really just beautiful to watch, to see. So there's real beauty there, which emerges as a kind of contrast so beautifully also, and unexpectedly also, because you wouldn't necessarily, I didn't realize how peaceful I had been during the first viewing until I saw Kathy's work, which is in contrast definitely keeps you much more on edge, and clearly that's intentional, but definitely it was I felt completely differently. But I also appreciated the use of detail and close-ups in the first work very much, and also the viewing, the moving sense even through photography by using single images as moving devices. So I really love that. And but they're completely different experiences, and I understand where Catherine Opie comes from, maybe knowing her work a little bit, and also her as a person, and also for what she represents in Los Angeles as an artist and as a photographer, and her social engagement. So I clearly understand her, how she would like to make a point. But I think it's incredibly beautiful and interesting that she addresses the architecture of her city in such a straightforward, direct way. And but yeah, I think there's real beauty in both works. But I definitely I also appreciated the contrast in Catherine Opie's work. Yes, there is this person who feels so angry, probably, and really wants to burn down beautiful houses. At the same time, he kind of lives in one of them as an artist. So I think there's also that feels like a contrast. And at the same time, I completely relate to it. I understand it. So I think that's also the experience, the private experience of a viewer, an artist, and maybe even the one of an architect. I also remember stories about John Lautner, who while was building the Sheets-Goldstein house, in fact was living himself quite modestly in a very different environment, and bringing nature in the form of maybe Christmas trees or something much more quite creative, in fact, and very artistic, but definitely different from the beautiful places that he was able to create. So I think all of that is really part of the history of these homes. So yeah.
I'm inspired really by both of you have been saying. I was thinking about, your notion that Marquer's film is sort of has this liquid dimension to it, liquid visuality, and of course, I think speaking sort of very traditionally in terms of the relationship of form and content, I think it's a very deliberate move to sort of represent this oniric dimension, this multiplicity of temporalities that we lose ourselves in, frankly. It has this dreamscape idea that I think Kathy Opie doesn't. In that sense, Opie's film is a more sort of traditional narrative. It has more of a linear trajectory than sort of the circular economics of Marquez. But then what you were saying, Luisa, about this close-up thing, and what I find striking in your images, but also in Marquez's film, and I think there's a real sort of dialogue here, is this haptic dimension of the image, and it's almost as if Marquez wants to visualize the material that the film is, and it still is, of course, a piece of, plastic. Whereas I guess Opie's film is a digital production, so it lacks this hapticity, and I'm really struck how Marquez was able to sort of visualize that.
Yeah, the term, of course, that Robin Evans always used was viscosity, the viscosity of the kind of intervening plane or medium, and the system of production. It's so palpable in Marquez's film. And something that I was thinking when Beatrice was describing House After 5 Years of Living, that the Eames's produced, the importance of color, I think, is difficult to overestimate, because the saturated, rich colors in that film, because it was a film composed of so many photographs in different lighting conditions, through different viscosities of glazing or atmosphere and clouds and so on. The role of color, I think, is an important one today, especially when we're looking at Luisa's work, which is so beautifully pale and beautifully desaturated. And I would say that Anastasia's work is also somehow at least low contrast, which she's described in the past as something that's a necessary conceit in order to convincingly stitch different pieces together. And then, of course, a lot of the work that Jesus writes about is pale, desaturated, intentionally not that technicolor, saturated, colorful world of Instagram. It seems to be the kind of artistry of desaturating at the moment, in a way. And so I don't know if, I think Marquez's film is obviously a black and white film, but in some ways it's more colorful than many other films because of the evident viscosity of the celluloid medium itself. And color operates, I think, similarly in House After 5 Years of Living, which is just a gorgeous, if you haven't seen this film, I mean, watch this film instantly. That would have been the third one that we screened tonight had we had time. So with that, are there questions from the audience? We have, could someone grab the microphone over here? And we We have a couple microphones that will circulate. Raise your hand and the microphones will come to you. Make sure to talk directly into the mic because they're very directional.
So thank you for the conversation so far. So within this conversation, I'm associating architecture with a mostly conscious expression of culture. And I'm associating collage with a mostly subconscious expression of culture. Within the collage, I'm enjoying a Derrida-like challenging of culture or understanding of it. And my question is, when does collage create? When and how does it create? And when and how does it destroy? Or does it have to do both to realign?
It's an interesting question, and it prompts thoughts about the content. We're now back to the kind of form and content dyad in a way. In other words, what is the content being incorporated, and how subtly and in what ways is it being incorporated? Perhaps back to the difference between the blinking eyes and the striking of the match.
Yeah, I think maybe I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer your question, but in my mind, I think architecture is in charge of creating cultural coherence, right? Or synthesizing the job of the architect, perhaps traditionally, has been to basically synthesize technical production into a coherent cultural product, right? And I think what your answer about the engineer earlier, Martino, has to do precisely with this moment of acceleration of industry and sort of change in society, where basically architects are no longer able to provide a synthetic, coherent cultural product out of this new technological revolution. And then on the one hand, engineers are put on the wheel, put on charge of, okay, if architects cannot do it, just make it happen, right? But then on the other hand, because there's this lack of coherence or synthesis throughout culture as a whole, then collage arises as basically a new way, finding a new way to work within that condition, right? By accepting the lack of coherence, right? And so in a way, I see it more as a result as opposed to an attempt at break and remake, right? It's more expressing, I think, an existing condition almost.
There's actually an interesting old essay by K. Michael Hayes on specifically that problem about photomontage in Weimar, Germany, where, the thesis is that, right after World War I, the Dadaists were really invested with representing the apocalyptic destruction of World War I as a total breakdown of culture and of visual culture and of the idea of the image. But soon after that, and I think he says circa 1922, I think that's even the title of this essay, there's then the constructivist move. So let's build a new world out of this detritus. And I think what collage artists doing and what photo monteurs do is precisely this reassembly of pre-existing elements from a world of the past into a vision of the future.
There's also something, I think, in your question, the assumption of a dyad, the conscious and the unconscious, architecture and collage. I think it's precisely one of the things that some of the artists we've been screening and listening to tonight are consciously trying to kind of undermine or transform. So, the kind of dyadic or dichotomous constructions of modernism and their intensification or acceleration during the postmodern period. I think it's not accidental, for example, that Pigpen is a non-binary character. We haven't touched on that. And so there's something about an intentional undermining of some of those modernist constructs and some of those dyads that for so many generations we took to be natural and inevitable: nature, culture, stasis, mobility, and so on and so forth. I think that's a piece of kind of where we are. Other questions? Yeah.
Sort of building off of what John just said, obviously, among the many differences between the two films, the nature of the protagonist is a really important one. La Jetée, it's a heterosexual male who can't quite achieve the relationship that maybe they want. A little hard to tell. And with Pigpen, it's a non-binary trans person whose only relationship seems to be with print media, which is really interesting. So, and the other thing that went along with that is that the sort of obsessive image of La Jetée is the one image that's a deep architectural space, the Jetée itself, while the obsessive image for Pigpen is a flat montage that's completely unstable. So I'm just curious, you know, to what degree does the subject position in that narrative matter, and what reflections people might have about that?
It's so interesting what you're saying, because yes, it's totally print culture only, right? And it's so consistent with what the architecture that he's obsessed with was also produced in the space of the two-dimensional pages of magazines, photography, etc. Right? So he's living in the present, but there is no appearance of you know, any of that other than that perhaps in the persona of Pigpen, right? Because there is no television, at no point there is any kind of appearance of any telephone or any kind of, you know, there is no, he always picks up the newspaper just to remind you that he's always on the print culture. So he's in the media of the period of the houses he is obsessed with, and in the media in which these houses actually could be argued that emerged, right? So that's also, it's a very interesting point that you're raising.
And they only appear on screen here.
Yeah.
In a sense, it's like dining in the Eiffel Tower, because it's the one place in Paris you can't see the Eiffel Tower.
Right,
You know, it's
right.
that comes to us as a screen-based medium here, but that's not represented within the rest of the film's narrative.
Right, right.
Other questions from the audience? You must have some questions.
I just wanted to build off this idea of the newspaper as media, and the fact that it's used by Opie and not other forms of media, other forms of social media, and the Dadaists who used the newspaper and the new objectivity, which looked at the newspaper as sort of a tool that was cut up and recombined. I'm wondering if there are any thoughts on the role of media that we see in the montage, and the role that the newspaper as kind of ephemera takes place.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very, very interesting connection to the early work of the modern architects that Martino was talking about. I mean, in fact, if you think about Mies, I mean, what always struck me most is the complete schizophrenia between what he is building in the 20s, which is this really conventional mansions for bankers and other people, like the Mosler House. I mean, some of these projects are actually scary in their conventionality, and at the same time, he's producing precisely in the space of the page, right? For Gestaltung, for all these visions, as Martino put it, of a world to come, right? These glass skyscrapers that, of course, nobody knew how to build. He doesn't know how to build them, but nobody else knew how to build a glass skyscraper in 1920. But it has an enormous effect, right? These images of a future to come that become possible only precisely in the space of the newspaper, and it was incredibly fertile ground for architects, and that goes back to your previous comment that it was possible. And then going back to La Jetée, I was struck, maybe it's because we are so bombarded right now with images of this ruined Ukraine that is so heartbreaking and devastating, that we are in this moment of this world in ruins. And of course, the film starts with these images also of a world to come, but the world to come is actually World War III, an image of the ruins of Paris, right? So it's very striking to me, no? This. I don't know. I mean, I don't know where I was going, but I suppose is the contrast between the idea of this positive idea of a world to come with these gleaming images of fantastic architecture, and the contrast with the image of the ruin. And maybe I'm also affected by the fact that I'm reading now the dissertation of a student at Princeton who I had been advising, and it's all about the destruction of Tokyo. First with the Great Kanto earthquake, and then, of course, the complete devastation of and the amnesia after the bombardment, the continuous bombardment of Tokyo, the amnesia of that generation that lived through this bombardment and that only started to recover the memory as if it were much later, right? I mean, all this generation that grew up of this moment, the Arata Isozakis, etc., that were basically very young at the time of the destruction of Tokyo, and that then only much later will come up with projects like, for example, for the 1968 Triennale of Milano, with the destruction of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, with images of the. So amnesia is also very, very. We talk a lot about memory with Chris Marker, but there's also amnesia, and how hard we work as humans to kind of forget everything that is inconvenient, right? And in the moment of this COVID, I'm also struck by the fact that if you go back historically, every time there had been a major catastrophe, like the flu of 1918, you know, as soon as the whole tragedy, as soon as the emergency passes, we come to an agreement of developing collective amnesia, to the point that this John Barry, that wrote the first substantial book on the 1918 flu, that then became a bestseller only, I mean, passed completely ignored, and became a bestseller only during COVID, is you go back to the book that I read at the time, not during COVID, but before, he writes in the introduction that he doesn't understand how nobody has done a substantial study of this pandemic that killed so many millions of people worldwide. Why are we not talking about it, and only became relevant with COVID? So amnesia is also a very significant part of what we do to deal with trauma, right?
And the other side of the story in terms of films like Tora, the multiple perspectives on the same event at Pearl Harbor, for example. So, you know, back to Steve's question about the subject position, and building on Bill's question in terms of media, I just kept thinking of what is the medium of the kind of psychotic terrorist or serial killer? It's usually a book. You know, it's usually a book of their kind of morbid thoughts, and they kind of paste things into the book, and the book gets fatter and fatter and fatter. Whereas on the wall for Pigpen, that was a little bit more like a crime scene investigation room, where, you know, those ridiculous like yarn things where they're connecting, you know, character 1 to character 4, and we're working our way up to John Gotti or something at the top. And, you know, there's something that puts you in a situation room as part of the apparatus of power and, you know, detective work that is being kind of shown from the other side in this world of Pigpen and the kind of paste up wall. It's books that they are going through as source material, but they're not making a book the way a kind of serial killer or terrorist would, at least in the films that we've seen. They're collaging on a wall. And so I think there's something about the subject position there that's absolutely, I would say, central to Catherine Opie's film.
Right. And also, returning to your question of the newspaper, the way in which he's actually building this that he will find next door, the next day in his doorstep, the image in the newspaper that he has anticipated, like a criminal in many ways, like many arsonists. The fascination with what they have produced, right?
Well, I wish we had more time for questions. We're going to have to wrap it up tonight, but please join us tomorrow. We will have the same wonderful panelists. We will have Beatrice Colomina, Luisa Lambri, Anastasia Savanova, Martino Stierli, and Jesus Vasayo with us in the Kent State College of Architecture and Environmental Design. Please, everyone, join us there at 1:45 tomorrow in our Weissman Frady building, and we will pick up this conversation then. Thank you very much to everyone.